Good morning. We're going to talk today about early spring vegetable gardening. Before we get into that, however, I want to talk a little bit about last year. If you're a little discouraged about gardening from last year, you're not alone. Everybody else in the state of Kansas was also discouraged about last year's gardening. A word or two about what happened last year, and also, will it happen again? Several years ago, there was a guy that wrote a book. It was called Plants Are Like People. And that's really not correct at all. As a matter of fact, it's pretty far from the truth. Plants are not like people. People have the ability to think and to reason. They also have the ability to move and pack up and get out of here. But plants just are equipped with a set of genetic characteristics that they're triggered to do certain things based on generally environmental conditions. And we had such a strange year last year in terms of environmental conditions that plants were in some ways sort of confused. Those triggers were set off at exactly the wrong times. I have here a printout of the weather conditions for last year, day by day, from March until October. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail, but I went through and highlighted things in this that were unusual for the time period. First of all, we began last year through the whole month of March, April, and May with some very, very windy conditions. I have highlighted here all the days that the maximum wind for that day was in excess of 20 miles an hour, and it's just a whole big long line of days in a row. In addition to that, we started out with a fairly mild spring in March, early April, but then when we got into late April, we had some varying days where it was up in the 80s and 90s, and then toward the end of April, 2 days in a row that it froze. And then by the time we got into early May, 4 or 5 days in a row of temperatures up in the 90s. And this sort of continued through the year. We had this up and down. And then when we got rain, we would get not just a nice little gentle rain, but we would get a lot of rain at one time. In some cases, a couple of inches of rain almost all at one time. And so the bottom line was this up and down situation all through the spring and summer, but it didn't end there. It continued all through the later part of the season. As we got into late summer, typically a time that we can get some cooling, begin to plant some fall crops, we couldn't do that. I had a set of fall plants all set to go in the ground that I wound up throwing out. We just continued to have that hot weather clear up until late October. So the question is, will this year be any better? And my answer to that is, it can't be much worse. So hopefully this year, we're off to a pretty good start now, and hopefully we won't have a repeat of what happened last year. Today we're going to focus on early spring gardening. One of the things I wanted to talk about is tillage. We have a situation in agriculture where we're doing a lot of what's called minimum tillage, in some cases called no tillage. This is done in commercial agriculture for several reasons. One, it is to stabilize the soil so that there's less runoff of soil and heavy rains. It's also done to minimize the use of heavy equipment and using up lots of diesel fuel in cultivating the soil. However, in our garden areas, tillage is a very useful tool. First of all, it's our ability to incorporate organic matters in the soil. And we can improve the looseness, workability of soil with organic matter better than we can any other way. It also creates a seed bed for some of those fine seeded garden crops. It allows us to hoe easier and water to penetrate as we get a rainfall. And also it'll remove any overwintered weeds if there's any weeds there, so you can basically start with a clean slate. So first of all, one of the first things that we have to focus on is that getting the soil tilled up. When we start talking about growing vegetables, there are two major subgroups of vegetables that sort of fall out into basically where the plant originated. Those plants that originated in cool, growing climates are what we call the cool season crops. They like cool weather. They don't like intense heat. The warm season crops, just the opposite. Crops that originated from warm growing climates, they do not like cold weather. We have a variable climate in Kansas in that we can grow both equally well. But we have to focus on getting those cool season crops in the ground early so we can take advantage of as much of that cool weather as we can before the intense summer heat gets here. Usually our intense summer heat begins about the third week of June. So we can get all those planted early and get things harvested before we get to the latter part of June. We're in good shape with the cool season crop. When we begin these cool season crops is based upon when the soil temperature reaches a certain critical level that will allow or encourage those crops to begin to germinate, or if we transplant things, when we begin to allow the plant to establish new roots and begin to regrow. Depending upon whether we're growing cool season crops or warm season crops, this varies by soil temperature. The cool season crops will not germinate, establish new roots until we get a fairly consistent 45-degree soil temperature. The warm season crops need a fairly consistent 55 soil temperature. And there are some of those warm season crops, such as sweet potatoes, cucumbers, watermelons, muskmelon, that really need a 60-degree soil temperature. Now this soil temperature is generally measured at 2 to 3 inches deep in the late morning. If you want to do this yourself, you need to have a metal probe thermometer, not a thermometer that you're going to take off the wall and put out in the soil. The cool season crops, if that soil temperature is not reached, they just sit there and wait it out. On the warm season crops, however, they may tend to rot in the ground. The root systems may not function, so that plants may not be able to take up nutrients and or water. One way of determining that soil temperature that's a little easier than having to go out and do it yourself is to utilize a resource tool that K-State has available. It's called the Mesonet. And this is a series of automated weather stations located all around the state. I think there's about 75 of them. And it will provide an average of those soil temperatures at 2 and 4 inches deep. So if we go to your website and click on Mesonet at K-State, you can actually just do a Google search and it will pop up. So when you click on that, there is a sub-menu, which are little bars at the top of the page that you can click on that will say agriculture. And when you click on agriculture, it will say soil temperatures. This is that page that you can see. And we are fortunate here in Manhattan that we have 3 of those automated weather stations located in and around the Manhattan area. One of them, that's called Manhattan, is located at the Agronomy North Farm, which is right across the street from Bill Snyder Family Stadium. The second is called Rocky Ford, and it's located at the Turf Research Farm, which is located out off Tuttle Creek Boulevard at Barnes Road on the way out to the lake. And the third station is located out south of town in the Ashland Bottoms. It would be about equivalent to where the landfill is, except it's over on the other side of the river. And as you can see in these websites, it will show you the average soil temperature over the last 7 days at the 2 and the 4 inch depth, as well as, of course, what the soil temperature is right today. So it's a very useful tool, and you won't have to go out and measure that. You can monitor that yourself. The second thing we have to be concerned about is the above ground temperatures or air temperatures if we have anything that's transplanted or if we have seeds that are coming up. Most of the cool season crops can tolerate temperatures down to 24 degrees. A few of the cool season crops can go below that. Cabbage, broccoli, kale, some of those things can go actually stand temperatures of around 21, 22 degrees. Usually by the 22nd of March, we'll have a 50-50 chance of not having those air temperatures get below 24 degrees. And for every 3 days that we delay beyond that point, we can have a pretty good chance of, we increase our chances about 10%. So if we actually wait until the end of March, we've probably got about a 95% chance of not having a freeze that'll get colder than 24 degrees to kill some of those cool season crops that may be coming up. The warm season crops, however, will not tolerate a temperature below 32 degrees. And the 50-50 chance of us not having a freeze for those warm season crops is April the 21st, so about a month later. And again, about every 3 days that we delay beyond that point, it increases our odds about 10%. Actually, by April the 27th, we've got about a 70 to 75% chance of not having freezing temperatures below that point. And historically, that's the time that our soil temperatures generally reach that 55-degree soil level, or temperature level, when it would be okay to plant warm season crops and not have the seeds deteriorate and or the roots of the plants not function. I want to talk now a little bit about some of the common cool season crops that we can grow in Kansas, and I'll start with two crops that are perennial. That's asparagus and rhubarb. These crops, being perennial, we don't harvest the first year. We have to allow them to get established. And in the case of asparagus, it begins to emerge about usually the second week of April. Rhubarb about the same time. Now with asparagus, of course, you'll be able to harvest it fairly quickly. Rhubarb takes a little longer for the plants to, the leaves to grow and get large enough that it will develop that large, what we call petiole, or the leaf stalk, is what we use as the edible portion of the plant. The plant will continue to send up these shoots or spears of asparagus as long as the food reserves below ground from the previous year have not been used up. And asparagus sort of tells you when it's running out of gas. And the way that it does is the spears begin to get smaller. Now, unfortunately, you don't go out there one day and all of the spears are real small. You'll notice a gradual change in the spear size, and as most of the spears begin to get smaller than a pencil, that's usually the time to stop and allow the plant to grow up into the summer growth, or what we call the fern growth, when we can reestablish the stored food reserves in the ground for next year. And we'll leave that fern growth or summer growth in place all the way through the growing season, clear up to the fall until it's completely brown, brittle, and dead. And at that point, you can make a decision to remove it. or a lot of people leave the fern on during the winter months. It helps to provide a little wind barrier. It'll collect some snow behind it and so forth. If you're growing asparagus, one of the most important things is that you get a full sun, well-drained location. Asparagus does not like to grow in the shade, and it also doesn't like to grow where there's standing water. The other unusual thing about asparagus, it has certain chemicals that it releases into the soil, so that if you try to plant asparagus where asparagus has been grown before, it'll die. And this is what's called allelopathy. So no asparagus for 10 to 15 years. There's been a lot of improvements in asparagus, some new hybrid varieties that are much more productive than some of the older varieties that we've had in the past. To grow asparagus, we generally plant what's called a crown or a root cluster. Rhubarb is the very same thing. The only difference in rhubarb and asparagus is in the depth of planting. Asparagus is planted usually about 6 inches deep. Rhubarb tends to be planted very shallow, only about 2 inches deep. Otherwise, both handle much in the same way, grow in the early spring. With rhubarb, the stalk size begins to get smaller and smaller, and that's a signal that it's time to stop. One of the things that we typically have a reminder to when to start, potatoes. Very common garden crop, and of course St. Patrick's Day is a typical time that we plant potatoes. Strangely though, potatoes planted in the middle of March don't usually come up right away. It takes a long period of time, and the main reason is that the part that we plant for potatoes is not really a seed, although we call it seed potatoes. It's simply a chunk, a piece of potato that we plant. And it takes a while for that plant, for that seed piece to actually begin to sprout and grow and send a plant that comes up. It usually takes probably about the middle of April before you'll have potatoes that will be emerging from those that you planted mid-March. There are several types of potatoes that we can grow. The first type are what we call round reds or round whites. These are potatoes that are rounded in shape and either have a red skin or a white skin. There's also another one of these that accumulates some beta carotene in the flesh, which gives it a yellow tint. And there's a variety called Yukon Gold that has a yellow flesh, and it will actually hold that yellow flesh as you cook it and prepare it. These round reds are typically commonly used. They're the earliest usually to mature, to be coming up and also to mature. And they're also what we call mashing potatoes. They have a different starch texture that allows them to be whipped with beaters and incorporate air into that, so we get loose, fluffy mashed potatoes with these types of potatoes. Another type of potato that we can grow are what are called russet skin potatoes. These have a brown russet colored skin, and these are typically called baking potatoes. And the reason for that is they have a different starch texture, which gives them a mealy, crumbly texture when they're baked. Also the type of potatoes that are used for McDonald's French fries. There's a couple of good varieties of these russet skin potatoes that we can grow here. We cannot grow some of the Idaho Burbank type potatoes that are grown particularly in Oregon and Idaho, but we do have several varieties of russet baking potatoes that we can grow here and do quite well. Some of the round red varieties include Viking, Norland, Lesota or La Rouge. White varieties include Superior and Dakota Pearl, the Yukon Gold that I mentioned earlier. And of those russet skin potatoes, Norgold and Norcota are the two common varieties that you can grow here and do quite well. When we start growing potatoes, we cut the potato into pieces. Normally, an average sized potato we would cut into 4 pieces, or we would generate about 8 or 10 seed pieces per pound of potatoes that you buy. This gives us a seed piece that it's about 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces in size. It's also a good idea to cut that seed 3 or 4 days before you're ready to plant it, and keep it in a warm location at basically household temperatures. And that allows that freshly cut surface to heal over, actually produces a protective chemical that's formed on that cut surface so that it will not rot in the ground. From that seed piece that you plant, there will be sprouts that come up and roots that come down. Actually, the roots come out first and begin to anchor the plant in the ground, and then finally the sprout will begin to come up. And if there's more than one bud or eye in that seed piece, one of them potatoes have what's called apical dominance. One of the eyes becomes the boss, and it's the one that actually sends up the plant. After the potatoes began to grow, they began to form little attachments onto the stem of the potato above the seed piece that are called stolons. And out at the end of those stolons, new little potatoes will begin to form. The take-home message is that potatoes don't form on the roots of the plant. They form on the stem above the seed piece. So in order to grow them and have them well protected, we usually do what we call hilling, which is to pull soil up along the row to cover about 8 to 10 inches of that stem, to cover the stem and allow the potatoes to begin to form. As I mentioned earlier, potatoes that you plant in March usually don't begin to come up until around the second week of April. And then many times the emergence is sort of erratic. It'll take maybe 2 weeks for all of the potatoes that you planted to come up. Potatoes need to be fertilized and watered regularly to get as much growth as you can during the early part of the spring. Potatoes don't like hot weather. Potatoes do not develop and form starch and enlarge once we get up into early July and get in an intense summer heat. So the critical thing is get them planted early, grow them, fertilize them, keep them well watered, and then get your harvest in before we get into that intense summer heat. One of the other common things that we plant in the garden are peas. And peas are a little bit unusual in that they will germinate at a little cooler soil temperatures than even that 45 degrees. Peas will actually start germinating around 40 degrees. There are 3 types of peas that we can grow in the garden, what we call English peas. And these are peas that have a thin pod, and we shell those out and remove the seeds on the inside. The second are what are called snow peas, or edible podded peas. And these produce a flat pod with a little seed starting to form inside. And we usually harvest those before the seed gets very large, because we cook them usually in a stir-fried manner. And then the final type of pea are what are called snap peas. And these are peas that have pea seeds on the inside, but also have a thick, fleshy pod, almost like a green bean. And these can be cooked like you would green beans, or many people like to just eat them raw in salads. So our ordinary garden peas, snow peas or edible podded peas, and then snap peas. Pea plants are notoriously not very sturdy. They tend to sort of flip and flop every which way. And so to grow them in a garden, it's usually best if you rig up some sort of a trellis. It doesn't have to be a very elaborate trellis. It could even be something as simple as just a few pieces of string or twine that you would wind down above the plants that barely give the plants a little protection from flipping and flopping. Some people like to plant 2 rows of peas close together so that the plants sort of lean on each other. One of the other real common early spring garden vegetables are radishes. And these are popular because they germinate about as fast as any crop that we plant in the garden. Radishes that you plant usually will be up in 3 or 4 days, and they mature in about as fast a time as anything. Usually there's a lot of radishes that will mature in less than a month, 24, 25 days or less. There are round red radishes, which are probably the most common. There are elongated white radishes that we call icicle radishes sometimes. And then there's some that have multiple colors, red on one end and white on the other. Radishes are also unusual in that we don't really have many ways of using them other than just eating them fresh. And so you want to be careful about planting too many radishes all at one time. After a few days, they will begin to get hot and pithy if they're allowed to stay in the garden. So it's usually a matter of having a few, wait a few days, plant some more, wait a few days, plant some more, so that you have a continuous supply. Another common early spring garden vegetable, spinach. Spinach used to be a cooked vegetable, and then suddenly we discovered that, well, we don't really have to cook it. We can use it raw in salads. It's become now probably a more popular salad green than anything else. Some of the older varieties of spinach had what a leaf characteristic we call Savoy. Savoy is a deep crinkle in the leaf of pucker. That was a good point for soil that was splashed up in the rain to collect. And so in order to get your spinach prepared, you would have to wash it and wash it and wash it in order to get the soil out of all those little cracks and crevices. We've now had a lot of hybrid spinach that's been developed. A lot of them what we call semi-Savoy, that has a lightly crinkled leaf but not that deep link pucker that would collect soil. And there's also a number of smooth leaf spinaches now that we can grow that actually have no crinkle to the leaf at all. The new hybrids are much more productive than some of the older varieties. The other nice thing about spinach is it can be planted in the fall, used in the fall, and then many times it will overwinter and go through the winter, and you can get an early crop in the spring. It will not last very long because it will tend to bolt or go to seed rather quickly in the spring, but you can get 2 harvests out of the same package of seed. We can also plant spinach in the spring, where we can grow spinach a little bit later in the season that will last until it begins to get really, really hot. Another common crop that we plant in the early spring is lettuce. The easiest and the fastest type of lettuce to grow is called loose leaf lettuce or leaf lettuce. And this forms a cluster of, not really a head, but just a cluster of leaves that come out from a central base. There's a lot of variations in leaf lettuce in terms of the color. There are some lettuces now that have a deep red color, some just a tinge of red. And there's also lettuces that have variations in the amount of frilliness to the leaf, some that are very, very frilly, some that have less of this frilliness to the leaf. Many of the varieties of leaf lettuce that we can grow now will be ready in about 45 days from the time that you plant it. 2 other very popular types of lettuce now. One is called cause or romaine lettuce. This is a very, very cold hardy lettuce. I've had romaine lettuce go through temperatures of 19 degrees and didn't seem to hurt it at all. And another type of lettuce called bib or buttercrunch lettuce. Both of these are what we call a semi-head or a soft head. Romaine lettuce is a more upright growing plant. Bib or buttercrunch lettuce is a more rounded, loosely formed head. So we need to plant these and thin them out so that there's enough room for that head to form. Very, very popular types of lettuce that we can grow now, and also romaine lettuce, of course, is the types used for making Caesar salad, and butter crunch lettuce used primarily as just a salad green. The most difficult lettuce for us to grow is what we call crisp head lettuce or head lettuce. This generally takes about twice as long as leaf lettuce to develop. For that reason, generally in Kansas, we usually have to start with plants. It's pretty hard to get in most Kansas seasons head lettuce to form until it gets too hot that the lettuce begins to get bitter. There's also getting to be quite popular now salad mixtures. Sometimes these are referred to with the French word mesclun, and mesclun is just a mixture of greens crops. So there's all sorts of leafy green crops that can be mixed together to form some of these salad mixes. And some of these have some plants that have a little bit of mustard relationships so that they develop a little bite or a little bit of spiciness. Others are more tender and don't have that spiciness, so you can find what they call sweet mesclun, which is basically ones that don't have much spice to them, and there's also spicy mixes and so forth. These are becoming very, very popular, not only for people to grow, but also in the bag salad mixes that you can find in the grocery store. One of my favorite groups of crops to grow in the spring are what we call the brassica or crucifer crops, the cabbage family. These are all related to one another and all cool-loving crops that do very well in our Kansas summers, including cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, and a couple of other relatives we'll talk about in just a minute. Probably the most common of these is cabbage. Cabbage forms a solid, rather sturdy formed head. We have a number of varieties of cabbage that we can grow. Some of the real early cabbages tend to form a head quickly, and yet the head is not very solid or firm. We tend to associate quality in cabbage with a fine textured leaf. So picking a variety that takes just a little bit longer usually will result in a head that is more solid and particularly has a finer textured layer of leaves that give you a nice finely textured cabbage that you can use for coleslaw and other fresh uses like that. This is a relative of cabbage, is that called Chinese cabbage, that grows very, very rapidly, germinates very quickly, and forms a somewhat, little bit looser formed head than regular cabbage. Also very, very popular now for stir-fried and oriental type dishes. There are some non-heading types of these that just produce foliage as well. Chinese cabbage relatives. Makes a very, very good spring crop as well as a crop that we can grow readily in the fall. Another relative of the cabbage is broccoli. Broccoli is actually harvested for its immature flower buds, and if we can get it started early in the spring, it'll form a main central head, and then in addition to that, after you cut the main head, it will actually continue to send out little smaller side shoots that we can harvest until the air temperatures begin to get really hot, usually in early July. Cauliflower is a little trickier to grow because it's not as cold sensitive as cabbage, or it's not as cold tolerant. I misspoke. Cauliflower usually when it gets down to 25, 26 degrees, kind of stops growing, it turns yellow. It likes a little bit warmer weather. But we can grow some good cauliflower in Kansas. We get the plant started early in the season, usually started from transplants. But we usually start that about a week or so later than we plant cabbage and broccoli. Another crop that's sort of gained in popularity in the last several years is kale. Kale is a cabbage relative and very, very cold hardy. There are two types of kale that we can grow. One is called curly kale, and it has a frilly leaf, and the other one is called Italian kale, and sometimes it's called dinosaur kale. I don't know why it's called dinosaur, but at any rate. Usually it's planted as a seeded crop. You can plant it from seed in the garden, or you can start transplants as well. Brussels sprouts are a member of the cabbage family that is probably the most difficult for us to grow as a spring crop, primarily because it takes a much longer period of time for the sprouts to form. It's usually about twice as long as cabbage to form. Let me talk a little bit now about onions. Onions are an unusual crop, and a lot of people don't understand some of the unusual characteristics of onions. First of all, onions vary in terms of skin color as well as shape of the bulb, and also in terms of how pungent they are, how, I wouldn't say flavorful, but in some cases the pungency is really a hotness. Skin colors, yellow, red, and white. Pungency varies from mild to hot, and the shape tends to be flattened or rounded, or in some cases even elongated. One way that we can grow onions are what we call salad onions or bunching onions. These are onions that we can plant in the garden in the spring and just grow them for these little immature, non-bulbing plants that we can chop up and use into salads. But if we're interested in growing onion bulbs, we start usually with onion sets or onion plants. The reason for that is onions from seed tend to be a very spindly, weak plant. They're very difficult to grow without weeds getting in them, and then when you try to pull up the weeds, you can pull the onion plants up. So we usually start with onion sets and or onion plants, which are little bundles of plants usually tied with a piece of string. Onion sets are little immature onion bulbs that are planted in the fall and grow during the late fall and then are harvested for these little immature bulbs. The onion sets are usually not well identified by variety, but now we're starting to see some sets that are packaged by variety, so you can get the varieties that you may be interested in growing. These bulbing onions are photoperiodic, and what that means is that they develop bulbs when the day length reaches a certain level. If you keep the day lengths short, they won't bulb. But as the day length gets longer and longer and longer, they stop growing tops and begin to form the bulb. And this is an irreversible process. Once they start to bulb, they stop growing tops and develop only the bulb. There is one ring of the onion for every leaf on the onion plant. So what you have to do is to first of all get onions planted early, grow them hard and fast so that you can get as big a plant as you can, basically the most leaves as you can, so that when that day length reaches a certain level, you'll get a nice onion bulb. Here you can see these onion plants. On the left, onion plants still producing foliage, still developing leaves. When the onions begin to bulb and the bulbs reach full size, the plant begins to get weak and flop over. So once the onion plant begins to flop over, that's the signal that the onion plant is ready for harvest. And onion plants need to be moved into a cool place to store them. If they're stored in a warm location, they will eventually sprout. And so we'd like to store them in a cool, dry storage location. I mentioned earlier that these onion plants were photoperiodic. They tend to produce bulbs based on the length of the day. Some onions begin to bulb when the days are shorter than others. And we call these short day onions. And they're the types of onions that typically we grow in the deep south, in Texas, in Florida, and along the Gulf Coast. These are onions for us in Kansas will begin to bulb and make mature onions in mid to late June. We have other onions that take a little bit longer, and we call these intermediate day length onions that begin to mature, produce full-size bulbs in early July. And then there are some onions that are called long day onions that actually begin to develop bulbs not until mid or late July. So some of the common varieties that you will find that fit into each of these categories. The short day onions include one called Texas Sweet, another one called Bermuda onion, and another one called Granex. And Granex is grown in various areas of Georgia. It's called Vidalia onions. So you can find all of these types of plants available here in Kansas and or as sets. But these will mature very early in the season, and it is difficult to get good size on these because we can't get a big enough onion plant soon enough before the bulbing starts. Intermediate day length onions, however, we can get a decent sized bulb. Most common variety of these intermediate day length onions is one called Candy, and then there's an all red version of Candy. It's called Candy Apple Red. The long day onions include one called Walla Walla, another one called Maui onions, and Spanish onions. There's a yellow, white, and red Spanish onion as well. So day length of onions is critical in terms of when they're harvested and or onions that you can produce to get a decent size. I mentioned earlier, onions like a cool, dry storage. Also, sweet onions do not store nearly as well as hotter, more pungent onions. The sweet, mild flavored onions are notoriously poor keepers. They have more sugar, they're more subject to rots and deterioration, so it's almost impossible to get a good sweet onion to keep longer than about 3 months. So if you grow those, you want to plan to eat them up fairly soon, and or you can chop them and preserve them and freeze them or whatever, but don't count on those sweet onions lasting for a very long period of time. A couple of onion relatives that we can also grow include garlic and shallots. These are probably best grown for us in the fall. We plant them in October, November. They'll put on a slight amount of growth in the fall and then grow rapidly in the spring. They will not bulb well if you plant them in the spring. We can still use them as flavorings. You can use the thin, small bulbs that they do produce, but to get the ones that will produce nice bulbs, usually have best planted in the fall. There's another group of vegetables that I call second early vegetables. These are ones that need a little bit warmer soil temperature to germinate, and we usually a little bit less cold tolerant. So we usually plant those in very, very late March to early April, and soil temperature is around 50 degrees. These include several common crops that we grow, one being beets. Beets are used as a root that we can either boil and or pickle. We need to thin them out so that there's a plant about every 3 or 4 inches to allow the beet root to form a nice round root, and makes an excellent fall crop for us, but also an excellent spring crop in Kansas. There is another crop that is actually a non-rooting beet. It's called Swiss chard. It's grown for its foliage, and it can be planted a little bit closer together than you would beets. And in this case, it's used as a cooking green and or a lightly steamed green. We've had a lot of new developments in the last several years with varieties of Swiss chard that produce different varying colors of stem. Typically, Swiss chard had a white stem or a pale pink stem, but now we have some that have a red stem, a purple stem, and so very colorful crop as well as a very nutritious crop because of the leafy green foliage that we can get from it. And another very, very common crop in this second early thing are carrots. Can be grown as a spring crop and or a fall crop. Usually for us in Kansas, some of the shorter, more blunt carrots are the ones that will do the best, staying away from the very long, slender carrots that are grown in some of the sand desert areas in the west. Varieties such as Chantenay or Nance or Danvers will do quite well for us in the spring, as well as planted as a fall crop. Again, remember, don't get started quite as early as you do other things with those because they don't germinate as well in cold soil. In conclusion, I wanted to talk a little bit about some sources of information. One of the common publications we've had in Kansas for a number of years is a publication called the Kansas Garden Guide. This has been about a 75, 80 page publication that was printed and distributed from K-State Research and Extension. It has recently gone through a revision, and there is a new version of the Kansas Garden Guide that instead of being about 75 pages long is 200 pages long. And it's designed more to be used as a web document than actually a printed document. And there's individual chapters on a wide range of individual vegetables. There's sections on container gardening and gardening in the fall and all these sorts of things. If you just do a Google search on the Kansas Garden Guide, issue will pop up and you can get to a location at K-State where you can download and or chapter by chapter read these various things on gardening in Kansas. And unfortunately, if you buy the printed version, I don't think they've printed any copies yet, but it's going to be estimated that it's probably going to be about a $40 publication to purchase. We do still have some of the printed versions around, and for example, if you go out to Blueville Nursery, you'll find some of the Kansas Garden Guides in its printed form, and the newer version of the Garden Guide has a lot of colored pictures and so forth, and the standard version has basically some black and white type pictures and so forth. There's also some good information at K-State. It's called the K-State Horticulture Information Center. And this is a wide variety of printed materials that you can either print out and or read online on a wide variety of different vegetables in Kansas, as well as other horticultural topics as well. So, first of all, I hope that we have a better gardening season than we had in last year. It almost guaranteed that it can't be much worse. I've enjoyed very much visiting with you and talking to you today, and hope you have good garden success Thanks. We'll see you next time.